I enjoy my meals. I do. Destiny has brought me here. Destiny has brought me this lamb chop.
Right.
You're listening to The Re-Engineered You. This is a podcast about self-empowerment and all the myths, lies, and misconceptions we tell ourselves. Then we use science and history to bust those myths and re-engineer a better you. I'm your host, Todd Laments, the extrovert.
And I'm the writer, researcher, and introvert, Joe Anthony, whose job it is to dig through the outer layer of no-duh on the internet.
2 years ago, we recorded our most popular episode to date, Napoleon Bonaparte and Manipulation, where we shared stories about Napoleon's true rise to power and how half of his stardom came not from his battles, but from his ruthless control of public opinion. As leader of France, he shut down a historic number of news outlets, especially those that disagreed with him. He put copies of his own image in every peasant home he could for free. And after his first major battle, where he got blasted into a ditch and almost drowned, he went out and paid the most famous artist in France to portray him waving the flag of victory on the bridge, as opposed to sucking dirt. To celebrate our most viral episode, Joe and I'll be watching and reviewing the 2023 Ridley Scott blockbuster film, Napoleon, during which we'll be busting some more myths about history, politics, and human behavior. Myths like, was Napoleon really standing in the crowd when Marie Antoinette was beheaded? Was Napoleon nothing without Josephine, as she claims? And was the Emperor of France as childish and impulsive as the movie would have us believe? We're going to get to our myths, but first I want to ask Joe, how does Napoleon rate as a movie? And how many gold laurels out of 5 would we give it?
Rotten Tomatoes has not been kind to Napoleon. Neither has IMDb. Would you say that this is, without the history context we have going into it, would you say this was worth watching?
It is, but you have to stay with it. I was real negative. I kind of went up and down on this thing, Joe. I hated it, and there's parts of it I loved it. And it's 3.5 hours long, but you first.
Okay. I think that's actually a really good way of saying it. Most movies are literally in their design made to make you like it more as it progresses. The structure of a movie, the structure of a classic Hollywood story, the heroic arc is designed to make you feel tension and pressure and also enjoyment and root for the hero. The more you get to know them, the more they have their tribulations. This almost goes out of its way to make you question Napoleon as a person and question his relationships and question whether you like them or not. That is a really, really risky way to run a story.
Well, I was very interested in this because of how many people we have hundreds of people a day that come to our website to listen to this episode. And to me, it was weird because you've done such a great job of researching these stories that no one's heard of. But something from the French Revolution, the late 1700s, in a foreign country, it just didn't seem like it would still be that powerful, and to be making major motion pictures about how many 300 years later or whatever it is, right?
Right. Well, the original episode we wrote because I had been reading pretty obscure historical research, and there were just really literally like 2 scholars who were writing about how much of a PR manipulator Napoleon Bonaparte was, and how incredible it is that like we don't cover that. Like in the movies and shows about Napoleon and the histories, you hardly ever hear about what you mentioned in the intro and what we talk about in depth in the episode, which is, you know, how good he was at shutting down presses and, you know, handing out his own image. Like peasants that don't have TVs will hear, you can stare at my face all day and hang it in your hovel. Like his level of public manipulation was incredible. This movie does not give that to him at all. Like most historical sources, it mostly focuses on his ineptitude with women and his, you know, ability to win battles.
Well, I was geeking out because this was the late 1700s. So then I'm trying to put down the American Revolution and all this stuff, and I'm thinking, did Ben Franklin ever hang out with his cat? Because he was our greatest manipulator. He was
Right.
one of our shameless self-promoters who got way more credit than things. I'm thinking, well, did they ever party and drink wine together? But the first thing that bothered me about the movie was the muddled accents.
Right. The crapshoot of accents.
Yeah, I mean, one was from Australia and one was from England, and and they were and none of them even tried. I'm thinking, man, can't we get some decent French actors and just do some subtitles and make this a little bit more, because it doesn't translate 100%, of course.
Um, I I am very glad you didn't mention that before I watched it, because my brain has the ability to tune out accents, but now I'm actually going to be listening for it, and I think it's going to bug me way more now that you've said that.
Well, and I told you before we started this, and I didn't want that hero arc that we got. That
Right.
That the world was against them. I like them when they're dirty, they're dirty scoundrels and tells the truth.
I felt like it was setting that up in the start of the movie. I felt like seeing him at the initial battle, like I think the Siege of Toulon was like his first real big one, and that's where he sort of set himself apart and got promoted. But it really felt like it was starting to set him up as that classic heroic arc. Like it was, he's a underappreciated military mind. He's from Corsica. He's not a Frenchman. He's an outsider. He doesn't, he's about to smelt a bunch of raw scrap iron into cannons and cannonballs that he needs for his artillery group. Okay. Let's backtrack a little bit, because it was setting up that heroic arc. It just didn't pull through with a heroic arc. It abandoned it. So let's first start with I think
Explain what the basic to an amateur storyteller like myself. Explain what this basic hero arc is.
Okay. If you watch a Disney movie or a Marvel movie or anything like that, you're basically looking at something that was called the Freytag's Triangle, which is a story arc, and usually it can be it's oftentimes referred to as the heroic arc as well, because you're usually following one character who is going to go through the motions of the triangle. And if you imagine a triangle, the first part before you start going up the side of the triangle, before you start mounting or walking up the mountain, is the hook or the inciting incident. And that's where we see Napoleon at the battle. Things are not going well. Everybody is like untrained, dirty, unshaven. His soldiers are in disarray. Part of the army has been dismissed or is in retirement. And that's showing that, there's a need. There's a call to action here. He is literally being called to action. In most other stories, it's metaphor. And then we go into the rising action, which is how they rise to power. Then you get the climax, which is they face their biggest villain. The story's tone flips. It goes from chaos to order, or from order to chaos. Like Napoleon makes order out of his world by conquering enough. But that's also where you get the almost at the halfway mark of any movie, you get the moment of no return, where they make a decision and they can't come back from it. Yeah.
You have that clear defined enemy, right? The bad
Right.
guys is very clear. It's not confusing, or it's not a gray area. It's black. It's Darth Vader kind of.
Right. And in this case, Napoleon's Darth Vader were Russians. But this Gladiator, Ridley Scott is the director of this movie. Gladiator very much follows that arc. And that's why it's so satisfying, because we've seen it a million times. We will never get tired of it. It's Beowulf. It's Disney. It's everything we've seen. And you can repeat those beats forever.
It is hard too, isn't it, with those beats, Joe, to not, if you're too honest, then the people aren't going to like the hero, right? So you got to kind of, right? You got to kind of promote them and manipulate us a bit, right? Tell us the parts you want.
Okay, you absolutely do. And to fit a character into a heroic arc, you have to take somebody who's real and really went through a lot of things, and you have to only focus on the moments in their life that fit those beats: the hook, the rising action, the climax, the denouement. You have to almost like you've got a pin board, like a map with all these pins in it, and you have to take out every pin that doesn't form that triangle, that story arc. And to do that with Napoleon is really difficult because he had so many battles and so many like chaotic twists and turns and moments where he made questionable political decisions, where he could have stood up for the common man. Like he could have, you know, formed a meritocracy, changed the way the tax system worked, made everybody more equal. He could have decided not to participate in the nobility that he was literally beheading, but he didn't. And he could have chosen to, get rid of Josephine, or alternatively, make amends with her in a way that's lasting, but he didn't. Like there's nothing he does in his life fits the classic heroic arc. So what we get is a movie that cherry picks parts of it to start making a heroic arc, and then it cherry picks parts of it later to make his character seem different than he was in real life because it's more interesting. So we get half of a heroic arc and half of a biography, and the two just don't really go together very well.
Do you want to Josephine? Steve, you want to talk about that later? Or do you want to talk about that now?
Well, let's kind of lead up to that, because that I feel like is the actual story. Like if you're watching, if you're watching the movie, you may be guiled into thinking that it is a war movie or a gladiator style character portrayal or a biography. It is not. It's a love story. It's a love story where they sometimes shoot the pyramids. And if you let's start with our coolest moments of the movie. I actually really enjoyed that. There's a part in the movie where like he shows up to Egypt and he shoots the pyramid with a cannon and like knocks off the top half. And that didn't happen. Like that was inaccurate, but it was very cool to see.
Well, it just shows, geographically how far they traveled.
Yeah.
So they traveled and they weren't dressed for there because they're from from so far away, a different continent, right? I mean, it's like, and they get there, and I'm thinking what it showed us is their ambition.
Yeah.
And just that, and the kind of thing of this guy is a bully. This guy wants to go and Alexander the Great kind of stuff. I want to conquer this. I want to own the world.
And it's only like 30 minutes in out of like a very long movie. So like they're already at his, historic, like one of his overreaches as a commander. And we're already in it in 30 minutes, which tells you how quick they want to rush through his life, points, like his dot to dot.
It's funny you say that because, we studied the French Revolution for a couple different episodes. We did the one about the lady, who's the queen that was beheaded. Don't eat my cake.
Yeah, Mary Antoinette.
Antoinette, well, she was in this too. So we studied that. What do you omit? Because it is such a complicated political, involving all these different countries and finances and kings and Congress people. And I mean, it's complicated.
Oh, as even going into it, knowing as much about, we have a book that's coming out soon. We have a whole chapter that's dedicated toward Mary Antoinette and, how demure she was when she went to her gallows beheading. And we have looked into the French Revolution for episodes. This was incomprehensible. Like if you go into this knowing nothing about Napoleon's life, you might as well go watch a slideshow with none of the dialogue, and you could be listening to heavy metal while you watch a slideshow in a museum, and you'll get about as much. Like it is unfollowable. But if you know the French Revolution, so basically the warning is, if you're going to watch this movie, watch a Ken Burns documentary about Napoleon first, and then go watch this for the spectacle.
It'll be worth it because it'll make more sense, right? I mean, there's just a lot of.
Well, it not only does it follow in a weird order, and not only does it rush through his battles and his life, it also puts in things that didn't happen to like ultra confuse you in case you weren't already confused. Like Napoleon was never in the crowd with Marie Antoinette. Like when she was being beheaded, he wasn't there. He was stationed south of there in another garrison. So like, and she like struts and looks like a very aggressive sort of like angry queen in this. And in reality, she like apologized for stepping on the headsman's foot.
So yeah, she's walking down. She's being led to the gallows, and this is a woman who's a queen. She's being spit on by people who are servants, by definitely the lower class, and then she's clumsily put into that part was really dramatic, where they can't quite get her head fit in there quite right, because she's so petite.
Right.
It looks very realistic. And then of the screaming of that we want blood, let her pay for her sins and her crime against our people, her people. He, Napoleon's just stone faced there in the front row. He's the only one that's not doesn't want to see this. There's a lot of symbolism there, I guess, right?
Right. Well, that is something I think is pretty much the only thing that I felt was historically accurate. It is the soul of what Napoleon did. It is, like you said, it almost seems like he has empathy for this queen who was called Madame Deficit because she spent so much of France's money while they were all starving. And
Well,
the idea that he would sympathize with that, or he wouldn't be
and throughout this film, he showed compassion for his people that he had beaten in battle.
yeah.
He showed that they weren't losers and they weren't to be taken. He respectfully would give them back and was kind in defeat or kind in victory.
Right.
He wasn't off with their heads, but only to the other people that he saw as his equals, which would be the generals and on up.
Correct. Yeah, very much so. And in reality, a lot of I think the reason why our past episode went viral, and I think part of the reason why people are looking at it now in this period of history, is when Napoleon had a chance to change the nobility. Like they got rid of everybody who thought that God had chosen them to collect everyone's money. That's effectively what nobility was back then. Is you were ordained by God, you were born into the right family and caste, so you didn't really have to work, and peasants were being taxed. And by peasant, I don't mean the lower 10%. I mean the upper 80%. Everybody was a peasant, and
Everyone but the
yeah,
royal family, yeah. Everyone
and
but the people that wore purple, right?
right, and they paid 9 different types of taxes. Like they paid taxes for wars, they paid taxes to the kings, they paid taxes to the clergy, not a tithe, a tax, and then they also paid tithes. So they were absolutely being raked for money, like to the point where 50% of everybody's money and crops went to just other people who had their hands out. Napoleon came through, shook up the system, beheaded the nobles with the revolution, but then he replaced them. He didn't change the system as he promised, and he did not. Everybody in France was desperate for this outsider to cling to the great man, to push this amazing general who just couldn't be beat, and to push him to the front of their movement and have him help them rearrange the government system. And he didn't. Instead, he seized power, and he retained the nobility. He built a new nobility, if you will, and it's the same. And you see it in the movie. Like that's what the praise. If you hear praise in our voice, it's because you see that. You see Marie Antoinette at the start going to the gallows, being very, foppish and regal, but also stubborn. And you see that exact same scene with Napoleon's wife when she comes out of they're living in a fabulous mansion, and she comes out almost in the same dress as Marie Antoinette went to the gallows with, and she's carrying like a Pomeranian. Like she looks ridiculous, and so does everybody else. Like the more they rise to power, the more opulent they get.
Well, we talk about manipulation, and that's the first thing I saw was how much the way he's dressed and the buildings he lived in were were made constructed in heaven. I mean, there were places that you can't even make nowadays. But then I noticed that they did a good job of of showing that he was beloved by soldiers, they'd show you things like the men coming off the battlefield and him sharing bread with them, handing it to them, almost like somebody would at Costco, building rapport. You talked about how there's parts where he says, "Do I look like I did in my portrait?" Right? Because this is a different
Right.
time. So, like you said, having his picture everywhere, being so noticeable was very powerful. It'd be the equivalent of being on TV all the time nowadays.
Right. And the movie does a good job of portraying both how much his soldiers loved him and how much the public was getting pissed off at him for causing several million deaths up to 10 million deaths, depending on whose count you side with. Like historians have different counts depending on like do you count the civilians, or do you count just the soldiers, or do you count everybody he killed and his soldiers? So he cost the lives of millions, and it kept showing that back and forth. They would, people would mention how much he's costing them and France, and then he would go to his own soldiers and he would appeal to them, and he would he would give them bread. He would brush shoulders with them and clap their hand, and suddenly they're with him again. So I thought that was cool. I actually really did enjoy that they captured the soul of why Napoleon fell out of favor eventually. There's a couple battles that I feel like they. By the way, the other half of this movie, we're absolutely getting to Marie Antoinette and the love story, but the battles are sprinkled throughout. They almost are the bookmarks or the indexes for this movie. The first one it shows is the Siege of Toulon. That is his setup as the hero, like we talked about with the heroic arc. That's his call to action, his moment, and it's when England and Spain have sent a combined navy to help the royalists. They're there to help keep the nobility in place, because if this whole equality revolution in France works, England and Spain are next. They have just as harsh taxes. They have nobility. They have people at the top who are, taking the money from the bottom. So if this whole thing in France pulls through, and freedom works and democracy works, then they're next. So they show up to basically, support the royalty. And Napoleon basically takes command of an ad hoc artillery command. He was an artillery officer, by the way. I should probably mention that.
He was?
Yeah. Like,
well, that kind of makes a big difference on the technology part.
It absolutely does. Like, okay,
on killing people. When other people weren't really into that, they're more into. I kind of got caught the things that the England were more into ships and more into a navy than they were into land. It's like, well, that's a bit. And you have all these artillery and you have these cannons and you know how to place them and are good at geography. It kind of makes a pretty big advantage.
Right. So anybody who is about to watch this movie, think about it in that term, that everybody else that Napoleon is fighting, just what Todd said, everybody else is the English have their navy. They even mention it in the movie. They're like, English navy is second to none. And the Russians have a ton of manpower and horses and cavalry and guns. But Napoleon is one of the first true successful artillery commanders. He trained for it. He went to school for it, basically. There's a reason why every scene he's in, artillery is what he uses to basically win the battle. Beavers build dams wherever they are. They can't help it. It's their nature. So was Napoleon. He showed up to his first battle, basically, the Siege of Toulon, and he saw, scrapped artillery, cannons that are not doing well, not enough ammunition. So he basically took his people and started melting down cannonballs. And he the more important and impressive part isn't shown in the movie.
That's resourcefulness, yeah. Right? These were thrown away and seen as not worth the trouble anymore, that they had seen better days. And he's like, no, we're going to clean this stuff up and kill people with it.
Right. He's like, individually, a ship is going to fire back on one of these cannons and blow up whoever is using it. But if we form a phalanx and we, have enough of these cannons and use them properly, you'll win the day. You'll take the city. But the more impressive part happens off screen and isn't even mentioned, which is he convinced a bunch of retired artillery officers in France to re-enlist on his side. He got 100 guns from local citizens to support him. So but people donated
re-enlist, weapons. That to me, that is very, very resourceful.
Right, exactly.
So you want to be part of this, right? Don't you want to be part of taking over the world and being
Imagine that heist movie where he's showing up at people's front doors and saying, we're taking over France, and they're like, you son of a bitch, I'm in, and then they, clap hands and they almost like that moment in Predator where they arm wrestle and they go out and they go to, kill off the English.
Well, now, if you're a weapons person and you're kind of if you liked adventure movies and violent movies, I have never seen, Joe, and you could tell me if you've seen anything close to this, I have never seen cannons portrayed like this.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And you see, there's a part of it where he turns him and he doesn't just use artillery on other countries. he also used it to get some control when there was some political problems to his own people. There was a protest, and he used it to blast civilians in the street, and you see it's brutal, arms being cut off and people being blown into half with these cannons. You don't really think of it like that, right? You just think of them sinking a ship here or there. You don't see them just blasting a horse, and turning it
Right.
into nothing.
I remember reading a cracked article 5 years ago, and it talked about the accuracy of what's portrayed in war movies. Then if you watch any war movie, no matter what era, it shows that cannons are going off in the background. You just kind of hear them. They're almost
it's like noise. It's like it's just noise, right?
It's the ambiance of war, and the people who actually do the killing are the guys with guns and the heroes who charge in the trenches and murder everybody with a bayonet. It was the opposite. In real life, it's like a 10-1, like where guys with guns actually just make a lot of noise and shoot whoever comes out of their trench, but the real killing is done by cannon. And that's always been true with artillery, and it still is true. So yeah, no, this it was fun to watch this movie where he is just, if you go into this movie thinking about it from the side of somebody who is an artillery wizard, then you just get to watch him cannon one thing after another. He's cannoning a ship. He's cannoning people in the streets. He's using cannons on doors, on city gates. He's using cannons on the pyramids and and a lake, rivers. It's more fun that way, I think.
What's funny, because I was a field artillery. I was a surveyor in the Army, and I was in the artillery. And I'll never forget this. When you're talking to Robbie, right back to this place in 1995 or whatever that was, and we were just doing, we're tactical training, and we're playing war. And our officer, our captain, explained to us. He says, "Well, if you can see the bad guys, you're dead."
Right.
And I go, "What?" And he goes, "Yeah, even through binoculars. If you can see them that close, you're too close. They've already got intel on you, and they've got metal rounds on the way, and you're close to." And I'm like, "Oh, really?" He goes, "Yeah, Todd, it's not the movies." You know what I mean? It isn't like the movies at all. You don't get to see them eyeball to eyeball. They see you, it's over.
I talked to a guy once who flew fighter jets, and I was like, "How accurate is Top Gun?" And he just started laughing. And he was like, "The distance you're shooting at, you don't even see them. Your computer picks them up most of the time, and they're not doing birds right over top of you and looking you in the eye." Dogfighting is like swinging really wide 14 miles away from them. It's crazy.
That's so funny.
They're a speck on the horizon.
14 miles away. Yeah.
This movie's war segments, there are some oh, by the way, the battle we were talking about in our Napoleon episode, the one about manipulation, the Battle of Arcole does not even take place in this movie. his most impressive PR manipulation. Yeah.
His big one, yeah.
Yeah, he proves himself for a second time as a genius commander, chases off two forces, gets blown off a bridge, has himself painted as the hero, literally hires the most famous painter in France to paint him as the hero, and it's not even in this movie. So the pyramids, like I said, never really took place. I'd say the one battle in here that is an absolute 5 out of 5, because it does what no other battle in this movie does. It takes the time to set up who he's going up against. It tells you what his odds are. It puts down there's a moment in the movie Gladiator where they're looking at the Germans across the battle lines, and they're having a discussion about how tough, what they're fighting for. The Maximus, the character, looks to his commander and is like, would we know when we're conquered? They set up the stakes, and they talk about why they're fighting, what they're doing. None of the Napoleon battles do that. So it just feels like a battle is dropped on us, and we don't know the stakes, and we don't know why we're fighting, and we don't know what the battlefield is going to be. And then we see cannons going off. Austerlitz,
If you were to rewrite this movie, would you make it less confusing? Because like you said, I mean, this building, there's the death tolls in the 30,000, 75,000, some of these battles. I mean, they're substantial battles.
Yeah.
They're not just little skirmishes. And would you take more time to arc up to that one and just build the significance of that one so it's not so confusing?
I would focus on probably two battles. I would make sure to show the other ones, but I would show them as a continuous arc of his career, and I would
Okay.
do that. I would build up to
Like
Austerlitz.
momentum.
Yeah,
He's building power. He's heading up, right?
right. And they do try to do that in this movie. But the problem is they don't do enough work to set up each battle and tell you who he's battling, what the stakes are, why it's a heroic moment. What Austerlitz is properly set up. If you watch this movie, you're introduced to the Russian emperor, and you're introduced to the it's called the Battle of the Three Emperors, and Austerlitz is amazing in history, just to read about. um, but they, the one quibble I've seen people online have is that Napoleon uses artillery to blow apart a icy river that
Yes.
people are fleeing on. So like he uses, almost like out of spite or childishness, he starts sinking people on this icy river to like spite them.
See, I saw that as he led them there because
Like a trap.
yeah, exactly, like he knew that was a lake because there was a part of it where it's a very dramatic part of the film, and it was a part that touched me probably the most. And the reason is so these guys are fighting, that they're just infantry and cavalry, mostly cavalry, and then they realize that they're out because it's in the snow, it's in the dead of winter, there's a foot of snow. They realize they're on ice, and that's when the cannons start dropping. So they're double dipped here. Not only are they getting blown about by cannons, but the cannons are then hitting the ice and they're sinking. And so to me, it's heart wrenching because I, of course, feel bad for the horses. These horses are drowning, and you can see hypothermia. People just go to, you know. So did I
I
misread that?
Oh no, that is exactly what the movie is about and what that moment is about. It just didn't happen. Um,
It's just
uh,
there was no lake, there was no anything. It was
there
no
was
ocean.
oh no, there was a lake. They got about two bodies when they dredged that lake after the battle. So they found two people who drowned and maybe a horse.
But they were probably
According to
swimming. It was probably
yeah,
swimming. It's a non-related. It was a local.
they want to do the polar plunge after the battle. No, in reality, he did in fact win that battle with the kind of cunning he had. He did sucker them into a battle. He let them spot, his forces, made them think that they were vulnerable. But the cunning plan was he just had high ground and made sure that they were going to get cut off.
It was geography. It was geography again. They just
Yeah,
pointed at
exactly.
cannons, and it was just pretty unfair.
Yeah. But the lake was such a cool scene. I'm gonna give it a pass. Like I would still rate that scene as 5 out of 5 just because it was an amazing battle scene and that was really cool. Like we do know that some people did drown from him breaking the ice, but it was not the absolute coup that it made it out to seem. um, but that's I well, okay. Before I start talking about why accuracy went out the window for this, because I do have an answer. Why they decide to scrap his history basically. Um,
Well, and why this is a burning desire of you to a big myth thing. The big thing was that Napoleon was just more of a politician, promoter than he was anything else, right?
well, yes, I think that what he was. There's the Schwarzenegger quote that I think is actually from somebody else. I think it's misquoted. It's do amazing things and then tell everybody about it. Um, and that is one of the best self-help piece of advice I've ever gotten. It's be the best at something and then make sure everybody knows it is effectively another way to say it. He does that throughout his life. He is the best artillery commander in the world, and he uses to his utmost the ability to manipulate and promote himself to the public. I think in our old episode, I don't remember how much it was, but it was like 90% of presses and newspapers got shut down in France, and only the ones that were allowed to stay open were those that were publishing his battles and looking at him favorably. Um, but I think this movie confuses itself for being a love story more than it shows him being any kind of good at politicking. It actually shows him being inept at politics. Like it takes opportunities to make him seem childish and churlish, and like he bites the head off people who try to give him good advice. And there's a lot of moments where like he is shown to be inept with women too. Um, so actually, how do you feel about the love story? If we're gonna split this into like two movies, there's the battle movie, which we're giving it a semi pass. What about
Okay.
just the love story alone?
Well, you know me. I have strong feelings about and strong opinions on a lot of things. Okay. I was disappointed that this very famous king, general, was so pussy whipped by this woman. It reminded me of Frank Sinatra being suicidal over a girl who didn't return his phone calls. This was right there with me. I'm thinking, how could someone this powerful be this obsessed with one woman?
I hadn't thought about it from the Frank Sinatra angle, but you're right on. It's the same level of all the talent in the world and the same level of all the talent, but also none of the self esteem for it. Like,
He meets this woman, right?
yeah,
And she's a widower, right?
and she's nobility. Like,
Right.
Napoleon is not nobility. He is very much a peasant who became a commander. She is her family has fallen on hard times. Like, I don't remember how many members of her family were killed during the revolution, but she is clinging to him for safety, basically.
And she's outrageously sexy and attractive. And
Yeah,
she's portraying this. She's just oozing of sexuality. And he's just smitten. And she could kind of take it or leave it. But when it really heats up was he marries her and kind of saves he saves her is kind of what I get. Like she's, like you said, probably, she is royalty and everything, but she's hanging on. And then it turns out that she's sleeping with someone the day after the marriage. The second he leaves town, she's found herself another lover. And it's very, very public. By public, I don't mean it's in the papers.
yeah, literally in the newspapers. Now, okay, so what is your emotional opinion on that? Does that make her a worse character for you?
It made her unlikable to me. The part that made her very unlikable to me was when he would ask her begging her to write him.
Yeah,
That kind of wrenched at my heart because I'm old enough to remember heart letter writing. And he think, why don't you write me every day if you loved me, but you don't write me at all?
I think that moment, that is a real letter, by the way. I've read some of the Napoleon letters. That one's one of the worst. Like, it really does hurt your heart, and I've had that happen. Like that's the same as getting ghosted by text, but they'll still call you once in a while. Yeah, and that is very real.
What made me think about how personal a letter is too. We did our prison letters about someone who takes time to write a letter and write their hearts out on a piece of paper. That just doesn't exist anymore. I mean, an email is not as much work or as much thought. When you start getting into your penmanship, your word choice, where you can't just delete something if you spell it wrong. You really got to sit down and take some time. Even a seasoned writer like you, think how much longer it would take you to write a series of letters than it would a short story.
Right. There's the element of he is putting in that much time and effort. Like, he's literally leading a cross countries campaign of war, and he is putting in that much time to write her that often. And meanwhile, she is sleeping with such high profile people that it's making it into newspapers, while she's supposed to be, with him.
And arrogantly not hiding it, obviously.
Right. But okay, so let's talk about that. We see it from Napoleon's side, so our heart hurts for Napoleon. At the same time, Josephine is somebody who's, her family has been gutted by the revolution. She is sleeping with other nobles. And so to her mind, Napoleon is just an option that has presented itself if nothing else works out. Like, he is a warmonger who isn't very good
Right.
at talking, and
He's
he has
not-
no couth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's literally a foreign thug
Right.
in that class, in the kings and queens class.
And meanwhile,
Right.
she's trying to use the only currency she thinks she has, which is her sexuality, to get back into the lingering nobility that is still allowed to keep their head. So like she's
This
a
is
lot
very
of
this is very similar to online dating, where they'll keep you around.
yeah,
They won't
exactly.
ghost you until they find a real keeper, but they'll keep you around just in case. Right?
Right. Yeah, and meanwhile everybody she wants to court is either dying, dead, or like is having to keep their head low so that they don't get beheaded too. So yeah, it was amazing. Um,
And you
there,
wouldn't think that this is a sexy movie, but it is at times. It gets
yeah,
kind of, it really does. You think, well, in the old days of this and that. No, it's just, it's pretty intense.
yeah. I think under different circumstances, this would have made a really amazing romance of a movie. But the problem is to get the romance out of it, you have to get away from the history of it. So there's the point where in real life, by the way, while reading Napoleon's letters, while reading Napoleonic history, in real life, I felt the same way. I was like, man, this Napoleon guy, what I thought he was immature. I was like, what a child. Like ditch Josephine, go find yourself an attractive person wherever you are going in the world. And there is that scene where like they both admit to cheating, but at that point Napoleon is like so high rank and has such power, and he is incentivized to make an heir and to to abandon her. Like literally his advisors start telling him not only is she not going to produce an heir, but she doesn't want you anyway, find somebody better. And he eventually does. And when he throws her out of the house, we get a semi-romantic scene in this movie where I don't think there should have been one. Like he kicks her out for cheating. She begs to be let back in. He lets her in, and then they have this heart to heart where they both admit to being terrible to each other, and so they're meant for each other. In
Right.
real life, she was manipulative as hell in that moment. It was more white trash than it seems. She had Napoleon adored Josephine's kids, which aren't seen in this movie ever. Hortense and Eugene are Josephine's children from another
Right.
person, and she is
I
banging
thought
on
that
his.
was weird too.
Yeah,
That she was already, you know what I mean? That she was already a mother with these other kids, and had already had a family before him too, being who he was and where he was at in his life.
right. And he doesn't let her back in because they're both equally damaged and isn't that romantic. No, it's because these two kids are crying and banging on the door with her. And it is very if it was a trailer they were banging on, it would make a lot more sense. But no,
Well,
I
let me
yeah.
say another part of this that was symbolism of how her feelings were for him. There's a couple of sex scenes where she's just kind of leaning over and he's very passionately having sex with her, and she's looking the other
She
way
looks bored.
with
Yeah.
with a bored look on her face. With a bored look on her face, and it's like, well, that's pretty telling that she's not even faking it when she's with
Right.
him. Not even pretending like women do with me. Faking that they like it.
Right. She's playing Sudoku. Like she's she's knitting while he's doing his thing back there. Yeah, it's and by the way, if you're wondering in real life, how did Napoleon put up with this? Like why did he go in for this romance that lasted forever and kept coming back to her and like brought her a child and carried on this relationship that lasted forever? It didn't. In real life, in the movie, it very strategically plans out a plot where he's with her forever. Even when he's forced to politically divorce her, he's with her still. And that's not the truth. He divorced her. Both Hortense and Eugene, his stepkids, they sided with him in court during the divorce proceedings, um, basically saying that Napoleon was faithful and Josephine wasn't. Now that could just be because Napoleon was powerful and they wanted to appeal to that and hold the
It's
offices that
political,
Napoleon
yeah.
could give them. Yeah,
Well, what I loved about it, and I don't know if you noticed this, and maybe I'm misremembering this, but there was just as many people at the divorce ceremony as were at the wedding.
right.
And I thought, why don't we do that in this country? Why is it there's a million people at the wedding, but no one's at the divorce, just you and the judge and your attorneys? Why don't we bring everyone for the public humiliation part? I think divorce rate would go down if we had to bring all the in-laws, and there'd certainly be more courtroom fights.
It would be a lot more fun, but it would also start feeling a bit like Eastern countries that that there is no divorce because you have your whole family looking on. It would. I would want it only when it is like messy Jerry Springer style. That's what I would want. Open divorce courts.
I think
When
it's
it,
great. Everyone was dressed up. It looked just like the wedding. It was just reversing. They were just undoing everything.
yeah, only when it's Real Housewives, then I'd want to be in there to see it.
Can I ask you about something that you haven't brought up, and I'm actually disappointed that you missed this.
Yeah, absolutely.
What is the thing that Napoleon's known for in every country in the world? What is the cliche everybody uses that they talk about a guy at work or a guy? What does he have? He has a Napoleon complex, right?
Right. And it's not the weird jacket he wore. It is him being short, supposedly.
What? So what is the significance of that? I don't get it. Who cares how tall he was? Do you know what I mean? What is the point? I don't get why that's stuck.
So we're
Gonna
gonna
use today for kids who don't even know who Napoleon is.
right. We're gonna talk about the biggest myth about Napoleon. You know how Americans didn't adopt the metric system
Right.
ever? Like French invented the metric system. Everybody else adopted it. We didn't.
It's simpler. It makes more sense. It's universal. Yeah. But
Yeah.
we like our yeah.
Because of like pre-metric French measures and the way that they didn't articulate well in English measures, standard measures, we assumed Napoleon was very short, like 5'2" or something like that. When in actuality, if you look at the original measurements and how they were written and how French measurements worked before metric versus standard, he was actually 5'6".
Which for the time was medium height or even a little bit taller.
It's above average. Yeah.
Yeah, because people
the
were
average,
a lot shorter back then, right?
The average Frenchman was 5'5", so like he was a tiny bit above average. So he was fine. Put him on a horse.
Yeah.
He cuts a good figure. Like
He was a dude. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, not even. So he's not even short.
No, he's not.
So if he was born today with our food and our genetics and everything, he'd be 5'11", whatever. Right. Yeah.
There is something I want to talk about when we talk about a person who is hypersensitive, who is bad at talking to women or just bad at socializing, but amazing at tactics, amazing at public relations, amazing at like kind of gauging how he can get ahead. There's a lot of theory now that he was a high functioning autist, possibly dyslexic, because of the way he wrote.
Well,
and
he references that
yeah,
I'm just really good at math.
Right.
and what he's talking about is, we talk about in any kind of a war advantage in life, you try to get an advantage, and his advantage, he said, was geometry, that he knows where to line these guns up. So he gets more kill for the buck than everybody else. And that's why he was so confident going against these huge numbers of, like you said, infantry and cavalry, because he knew he just was really good at, which makes sense that he was somewhere on the spectrum with math.
Right. And that's exactly it. Is a lot of the theory is that like he had superstitions. He had superstitions about numbers that were really weird, kind of like what's the electricity wizard, Nikola Tesla. It's he might have been on the autistic spectrum with Nikola Tesla, like that kind of.
And it makes sense why his relationships would be troublesome, right?
Yeah.
And that he found somebody that he could live with, that didn't drive him crazy, that he understood, that we'd be a little bit more sensitive to that. And
it's funny that the the guy that can do geometry in his head so well that he can cannon everybody to death in the Napoleonic world, he hooks up with the one woman who is like the best at manipulating the social fabric around her and like keeping guys on the hook. He found the exact worst person for him to fall in love with, in my opinion. Like as far as like these people's talents could have absolutely complemented each other, but they just didn't. Like it's almost willfully didn't.
And if they could have worked together and actually been on the same team, they could have taken over the world, literally.
Right. Yeah, exactly. She could have easily told him, "Hey, don't go fight in Russia." And yeah, who knows? Okay, so there's one last thing I want to get to, if you're okay with it. I want to talk about why this almost willfully and gleefully scraps parts of history and ignores the realities of Napoleon. Um, when you were watching this, did you feel like did you feel like they were doing this on purpose, like that they were ignoring parts, or was there any part that you were like, that doesn't seem like it's right?
A lot of it did. A lot of it didn't seem the timeline didn't seem to make sense to me. It just didn't seem like enough time, you know.
that's yeah.
Go ahead.
Go- I was gonna say that is pitch perfect. Like that is exactly what one of the biggest issues they ran into when writing this was, how the hell are they going to fit? How are they going to tell all of Napoleon's life in only a movie's time, but also make it a love story, but also make it a war movie?
Yeah, and there was a lot of that too. How could you be in two places at once? I mean, in his battles, he killed 3 million people. I mean, he was busy,
Right.
you know, and this was not with drones. You know, he was there, and just the traveling there. Just if you think about the logistics of traveling an army with horses and feeding them and booting them and everything, it just takes like a long time, right?
Right. The movie would literally be bogged down by quotes at the bottom every 5 minutes. It said, 3 months of marching later, 1 year of marching later, upon
Right.
return. The whole movie should have been little subtitles that tells you how absolutely long a time we're skipping over. Um, One of the reasons for this, and one of the reasons for all of the historical, I'll call them intentional oversights, like they're intentional blind spots where they just didn't cover something, not for time purpose, but because it wouldn't tell the story they wanted it to be. It's because Ridley Scott doesn't like reading biographies.
You got to be kidding me. So he just didn't want to do the time, the research.
Okay, so I got this
genuinely
quote.
Wasn't interested in it.
Yeah, exactly. So there's this quote by the New Yorker who interviewed him, and he said that it says he gave up after one or two books, or two or three books, and he ordered his screenwriter to do the reading. He's like, "Hey, Scarpa, read about this guy," and he says,
Secondhand.
"Yeah." So
Isn't that just fucking lazy? I mean, right? And this guy, I was made a joke with Joe when he told me to study for this show. I'm like, this director is old enough. He might have been around back in those days. I mean, he's in his 80s or something. You think he'd be more interested? You think he would have already read about this stuff as an educated young man?
Right, and he comes off more like a curmudgeonly old man who doesn't want to read. He says, "quote Everybody has an opinion about what really happened, and I always ask, were you there?" And then he says, "quote There are 10,000 books about Napoleon, and they're full of both truth and conjecture. But I left reading books to the poor bastard who had to write the screenplay."
Oh my goodness! Why would he admit that? He doesn't even have that filter. He doesn't even have that PR sense.
Right. I think once
But
he's...
it shows. It shows,
Yeah.
right? It shows.
It does show, and I think there are enough movies he's done where it works to do that. Like Gladiator, there's no historical accuracy there whatsoever. Like it works so well in Gladiator to ignore history, but in this, it doesn't. When you're dealing with a unknown gladiator from a period of history that we have very little evidence on, and it's so far in the past, and it's mixing different characters from history together who didn't actually know each other or talk to each other. It works because you're just telling a story, and you happen to be almost like name dropping historical names because it's fun. In Napoleon, since it is such a well studied period of history, we have so much evidence about it. We have written histories. We have the taxes. We
Change
have...
the world.
Yeah, we have their journals. We have their notes. We have their letters to each other. You can't really do that. It just doesn't work, and it shows that it doesn't work. But the probably the best and coolest quote I found that explains why the hell we were watching this movie came from the screenwriter. He tried to do something, and it got bogged down by the big movie part of it. Scarpa, the screenwriter, said, this guy, the bizarre disconnect in a guy who is able to kill 80,000 people on a battlefield in Eastern Europe, almost as a sporting event, and yet to him, it simply wouldn't be sporting to deal with his rival for his wife's affections.
I like that.
Yeah.
I really like that. Well, you know how Napoleon died, right?
Was it ulcer?
That's right. It's also stomach cancer, ulcers. Is so. So I wonder, and I ask you this: was it from bad diet and, like you said, those 1 year marches and eating wherever they off the lamb, or was it this woman? Was it worrying about this woman that causes his ulcer and killed him? It wasn't all those wars.
It I really wonder that myself. Like he had the ulcer. He was drinking himself to death when he was on the island. Like I think that was one of the problems is he ate and drank so heavily by the end of his life he didn't care anymore. Um,
I would be so mad if I was out in war and I'm reading in the newspaper, my wife's sleeping with this dude. I mean, I can't tell you how upset I'd be. And knowing that I can't fight with her for another year, that would
right.
even be more torturous.
Knowing that she's already passed away and you still have all this evidence.
And
Yeah.
she continued after, right? Because you're still getting newspapers, right?
Right.
She's still sleeping with people even though she's not alive.
That's when you shoot whoever's delivering newspapers to his island.
Isn't that funny? Like, okay, you're gonna go put you on this tropical island off the coast of Africa. You know what I mean? Like, talk about, you know what I mean? Like, okay, you're not gonna cut your head off or anything, throw you in prison. No, they're just gonna,
That is actually interesting.
you know what I mean? Like,
He's living in a
oh,
period of time where they're beheading everybody they
yeah,
didn't like or agree with.
yeah. And they just say, we're gonna put you on paradise and no one's gonna fuck with you. We just gotta check in on you twice a day, you know?
Right. And he almost gathers an army to come back and take his throne again. Yeah. I I wonder if that was sort of like recognizing that if they had killed him and martyred him, that there was still such a huge population that would support him no matter what, regardless of him killing, 1 million Frenchmen or 3 million Frenchmen or whatever it was. It I wonder morally if that was the reason. I think it might be.
Okay.
Yeah, put him in
Would you,
life in prison was the only thing they could do, really.
do you see the similarities between this and okay, the Sinatra? There's probably a lot of them, but the being on the spectrum of being talented, I think of Abraham Lincoln with his wife, these very obsessive men who, in their personal relationships, are, you know what I mean? Because with any sense, Abraham Lincoln should divorce his wife. You know, she's a psycho,
Right.
but they just can't. They just lock onto something. They're just they're on the spectrum. You know.
This one of the best speech coaches I ever had said, anytime you talk about somebody else's story, always include the radio station WIIFM. What's in it for me?
Yeah.
For me, I'm glad you are dragging us through this portion of it, because I think this is the most valuable takeaway from Napoleon, is that there are talented men who, you and I are very sensitive and we pay a lot of attention to what our partner thinks and feels because, we're probably because we're insecure in that way,
Right.
if I'm being
It fits
honest.
us. Yeah. We felt
Right.
yeah.
But I think there is a certain subsect of men where, like, they have extreme talent, they have extreme ability, they have a lot of attention to pay toward things that are, quote unquote important, like
Right.
war, or
Well,
or emancipation or whatever. And I think that they use the importance of what they're doing as an excuse to not pay attention at home.
well, that's what he said in Napoleon said in this movie. You know, I know it's not scripted from the actual life, but there was a part where he said, "I'm not the kind of man to be so insecure on little things like insecurity.
Right.
That doesn't get my time. Wars do, but me feeling hurt, having a broken heart because you slept with another man, I'm not that weak, little. I'm not that small. You
Yeah.
know, like a common. I'm not a common man that would bother. I don't. That doesn't bother me because I'm above that.
Yeah.
Right.
He literally considered himself a god at some points.
But I
And
kind of like that though, right?
yeah,
I'm not going to let that bother me it would bother me, right?
that's the story of the Social Network, the Mark Zuckerberg story. That's the story of Mad Men. That's the story of so many great men, quote unquote biographies, or at least like interesting stories. They use the greatness of what they're doing as an excuse to not pay attention to the small things. when in fact the small thing leads to loneliness, and that becomes the biggest thing in their life at the end.
You've been listening to The Re-Engineered You. Thank you so much for listening to the show. You mean the world to us. We have a new episode every week.
You can connect with us at www.re-engineeredyou.com. That's where we have research links, show notes, feedback, and blog articles for each of our episodes.
We're not experts in anything, but we've got an opinion on everything.